The morning sky over Bart Township, Pennsylvania, on March 3, 1821, opened not with the soft pink hue of spring's promise but with a hard streak of crimson that spilled across the clouds like blood poured over glass, and every farmer who saw it paused mid-step on their porch, every milk pail stopped clinking, and every rooster hesitated in its call, as if the animals themselves felt the weight of a morning that had no business feeling that heavy. The Amish call it the rat ruff, the red cry, and though they rarely speak of omens or signs, something about that light made the air brittle, like the world had taken a deep breath and forgotten how to exhale. Doss Hill, with its gentle slope and its view over the low-lying valley farms, looked peaceful as always at a glance, but there was something in the silence that lingered above it that day, a tightness in the wind, a watchful stillness in the trees, and the schoolhouse that sat at the crown of the hill, humble and unpainted, stood like a gravestone that had been carved in advance. The building had been there for almost 30 years, built by hand in the old way, no nails, no ornament, just pine boards locked together with pegs and scripture and faith, and though it had no steeple, no cross, and no bell visible from the outside, the children who attended it every day knew its voice. A cast iron bell mounted inside, rung every morning by their teacher, Miss Esther Zook, with hands that trembled more than she ever let on. That morning, 11 children trudged up the dirt road toward the schoolhouse, their shoes wet with spring thaw, their breaths white against the morning frost, lunch pails clinking gently at their sides like little church bells in a funeral march. They spoke little. Amish children were taught quiet early, and the world taught them silence deeper still. It was Mary Beeler, age 8, who first caught the SCE. N.T., sharp, acrid, not wood smoke but something fouler, like burnt oil and scorched fabric, and she turned to her older brother, Samuel, to ask if maybe the teacher had come early to light the stove, but he only looked ahead, eyes narrowed. There was smoke, yes, curling in slow, lazy ribbons from the seams of the roof, and then suddenly a burst of black push from one of the side slats like a long exhaling soot. It was Esther who screamed first, not from inside the building, but from behind it. One of the older boys, Isaac Stoltzfus, would later say he saw her silhouette for just a second, running, barefoot, hair loose, hands outstretched as if trying to stop something, but before anyone could reach her, the entire schoolhouse ignited as if the wood itself had been soaked in lamp oil. Flames licked the doorway, then climbed the seams of the roof, then devoured the walls in great gulping bites, and within minutes, the building that had stood since 1792 was no more than a roaring black torch on the hill. By the time the elders arrived, having been alerted by a scream that no one would ever quite describe without their voice breaking, the fire had already begun to consume everything inside. Buckets of water were useless, the flames hissed and laughed, dancing higher with every effort to douse them, and some said later that the fire didn't look like a normal fire at all. It moved against the wind. It burned cold in places. It made no sound where sound should have been. But these were whispers, spoken only after nightfall, when the women sat with their heads covered and the men paced outside with hands folded too tightly behind their backs. When the flames finally died, all that remained inside the stone foundation were 11 small piles of ash and bones, burned so cleanly, so precisely, that even the town's midwife, who had seen 100 bodies prepared for burial, said she'd never seen bones stripped so completely of flesh. What made it more disturbing was that nothing else around the site had burned. The nearby grass remained untouched. A coat hanging on the wooden fence was singed but not destroyed. A slate tablet left on the ground was blackened but not cracked. The fire had taken only what was inside, and only what was living. And Esther? She was gone. No body. No clothing. No remains. Only a single shoe, found 20 feet from the schoolhouse, still laced and unburnt. The Amish, by their nature, do not summon outsiders in times of trouble. Their grief is private. Their sorrows are buried beneath hymns and hand tools. No constable was called. No English coroner was consulted. The families gathered quietly, held a service without coffins, and lowered 11 empty boxes into the earth, each filled with a doll, a hair ribbon, or a single scorched mitten. Yet the silence that followed was not peace. It was denial. And denial cannot hold back rumor. Within days, strange stories began to surface. One of the men, Josiah King, a slow-speaking carpenter known for seeing too much, claimed he saw a second set of boot prints behind the schoolhouse that morning, deeper and wider than any child's, leading toward the back door and then disappearing into the woods. Others dismissed it, said it was a hunter, or a passing traveler, but Josiah was not the kind to imagine things. Then came the desk. One of the only pieces of furniture that had not been completely destroyed was the desk of Jacob Lapp, the youngest of the students at just 6 years old. The fire had licked its corners and blackened the top, but carved deep into the soft wood was a phrase that sent chills down every spine that read it. It came before the bell. Those 5 words, burned into the wood with a child's fingernails, it seemed, told a story no elder wanted to hear. It meant something had already been inside before Esther rang the morning bell. Something that didn't come up the path with the children. Something that waited. The elders called it the wrath of God, a punishment for pride or hidden sin. Some whispered that it was because of the schoolhouse's new books, donated by an English woman who had once lived among them but left the Ordnung for reasons never spoken. Others said the fire was born from Esther herself, a woman who never married, who lived alone, who often stared too long at nothing and walked at night near the woods. But there was one man who did not speak easy words of punishment or guilt. Bishop Eli Stoltzfus, gray-bearded and hollow-eyed, sat quietly at every gathering, listening more than talking, and when the last box was lowered into the earth and the last hymn hummed through trembling lips, he did something no bishop in Bart Township had done in 60 years, he wrote letters. One to a man in Lancaster who had once lived among the Mennonites but had studied forbidden books. One to a woman in Harrisburg who had left the Ordnung under accusations of strange worship. And one to a boy, now a man, who had been cast out of the community for speaking in tongues and claiming to hear voices beneath the soil. Why these people? Why now? Because Bishop Stoltzfus knew something the others did not. He remembered the fire of 1807. He was just a boy then, too young to understand the politics of silence, but old enough to remember the smell. It had happened on the same hill, in the same place. The schoolhouse that stood there now had been rebuilt twice already, once in 1808. And once again in 1793, after an earlier, lesser-known fire that had killed 3 children and a substitute teacher whose name no one could now recall. Each time, the building was burned beyond repair. Each time, no proper cause was found. And each time, the Amish elders swore never to speak of it again. But Bishop Stoltzfus could not shake the feeling that they had built over something they did not understand, or worse, something they thought they had buried. He remembered old stories his grandfather told in hushed tones, of settlers who bought the land from Englishmen who themselves refused to live on it. Of a Lenape burial mound flattened by a plow. Of an old preacher, not Amish nor Mennonite, who had come to the area in 1761 with strange books and built a chapel on Dawes Hill that was said to hold a hole in the floor that led to judgment. No records remained of that man. No grave. Only his name, whispered once in a letter found in an attic years later, Preacher Emery. The bishop visited the site alone one night, a lantern in hand, and stood at the charred edge of the schoolhouse's ruins. He prayed, not for the children, but for clarity. For courage. For the strength to say what must never be said. That the schoolhouse was cursed, not by man, not by nature, but by something older than either. Something buried beneath it. The wind howled through the trees and made the bell sound again, though it had melted in the fire. And in that moment, the bishop knew the truth was not hidden in what had just happened, but in what had happened before, and before that, and in the earth beneath those hills that had never been truly still. They had tried to forget him, to erase his name from the memory of the township, from the benches where he once sat, from the Bible his father had torn in half the day the shunning was announced, but the fire had a way of calling back what had been buried, and so it was that 30-year-old Levi Glick, now wearing English clothes and riding in a hired coach with leather seats and brass hinges, returned to Bart Township in the spring of 1821 after receiving a letter sealed not in wax but bound with a black thread, a sign he had not seen since he was a boy of 6. The day after the first fire at Dawes Hill took his sister Miriam and turned her into a silence no prayer could reach. Levi had tried to live in the world of the English, learning their words, their math. Heinz, their clocks and gas lamps and strange, hollow churches where no one washed the feet of their brother, but even in the heart of Lancaster's bustling markets, even among the glittering spires of Philadelphia's colleges where he worked as a janitor by day and read forbidden books by night, he could not unhear the sound of the schoolhouse screaming, could not forget the way the wood blackened too fast, how the flames did not flicker but surged like a single great hand clenching into a fist. How the teacher had stood at the doorway and whispered something before she vanished into the fire, how Levi, the only one spared because he had been sick that morning and left home late, saw a shadow closing the door from the inside before the first scream began. The letter from Bishop Stoltzfus was not long. It did not beg, nor did it accuse. It simply said, "We have lost more children. You may be the only one who knows why." That was enough. He returned not to be forgiven, he knew the Ordnung would never allow it, but to testify. And when he stood again on Dawes Hill, staring at the black crater where the schoolhouse had once stood, surrounded by elders who would not look him in the eye, Levi began to speak, not with the guilt of a child but with the fury of a man who had held his silence too long. He told them everything, how the schoolhouse had never felt right, even in the earliest days, how the floorboards would creak in the absence of footsteps, how the oil lamps would flicker blue and then suddenly extinguish as if choked by unseen fingers, how the windows would fog not with breath but with something coming from the outside, pressing against the glass with invisible mouths. He remembered how Miriam had drawn a figure on the slate wall in charcoal, a shape that looked like a man with no face and too many fingers, and how the next day, her mouth had been sewn shut with invisi. Bleeth red, she could not speak, not even scream, as she burned. He remembered how, weeks before the fire, strange papers had been hidden beneath the school's foundation, pages he had once glimpsed. When retrieving a fallen coin from a crawlspace, filled with symbols that hurt the eyes and lines that ran not left to right but in spirals and blood-red ink. No one believed him then. Not even his father, who beat him for imagination and said no son of Glick blood would ever see demons where there were only mice and dust. But 3 fires in 30 years, always children inside, always unexplained, it was no longer imagination. It was legacy. He pulled from his coat a folded, yellowing map, drawn not by modern hands but copied from a county survey done by settlers decades earlier, and he laid it flat on the bonnet of a wagon beneath the shadow of the burned hill. "This is not just farmland," he said. "This hill has a mouth." The map showed what the Amish elders had chosen to forget, or perhaps had always known but swore never to speak aloud. Beneath Dawes Hill, a limestone cavern collapsed in the 1770s, marked on early settler records as hollow ground and avoided by the Lenape who once hunted the forests here, who called it in their tongue something that roughly translated to "at the place where the earth weeps black." Levi's finger traced the edge of the hill to a soft depression behind the schoolhouse ruins, where old grass grew in a crooked ring and where, beneath the soil, the map suggested there was a sealed chamber, possibly a tomb, possibly a vault, certainly not natural. "You built your house of learning," Levi whispered, "on top of something meant never to be opened." The elders conferred, some in whispers, some shaking their heads violently, but Bishop Stoltzfus, whose own eyes looked as though they had stared too long into ashes, nodded slowly and said, "Then we will dig." The following morning, a crew of strong-backed men from the community gathered with spades and shovels, digging in the tight circle of dead grass where the ground felt too soft, too warm, as if something below still breathed. The earth gave way faster than expected, and within hours they hit stone, not natural rock, but a wall of carved limestone set with mortar made from something darker than clay. As they cleared it further, a seam emerged, a crack, no wider than a child's hand, but clearly not accidental. A doorway. Rectangular. Iron-bound. And at its center, sealed with wax now blackened by time, was a sigil none of them could read, 3 loops wrapped in a triangle, surrounded by symbols that looked not carved but pressed, like seals on parchment. Levi backed away at once. "Don't open it," he warned, "not yet, not until we know what it binds." But it was already too late. The mere act of uncovering the door had changed the air. The light dimmed. Birds no longer flew overhead. Even the cows in the nearby pastures began to moo with low, anxious bellows as if something ancient and cold had pressed its face against the veil of the living world. That afternoon, Bishop Stoltzfus vanished. He had been last seen walking alone up Dawes Hill at sunset, carrying a candle and his grandfather's Bible, and by nightfall, when his absence was noticed, searchers found only the Bible, open to a passage in Leviticus about forbidden sacrifices, lying at the base of the unearthed door. No tracks. No cloak. No blood. Just the scent of burned beeswax and the faint echo of a sound that had no clear source, the ringing of the school bell, even though the bell had melted in the fire and no longer existed. Panic spread quickly, though it wore the face of prayer. The community gathered by lantern light to read psalms, to sing in minor keys, to beg forgiveness for sins unnamed. The women wept in silence. The men walked the perimeters of their fields with lanterns turned low, as if afraid too much light would reveal something staring back. And Levi, sitting apart on a stone with his coat drawn tight and his face turned toward the windless sky, whispered the name he had never dared say aloud, Emmerich. It was the name found in the margins of old diaries, in the folded pages of hymnals tucked away in barns. A preacher who came before the Amish settled Dawes Hill. A man who wore no cross but spoke of an unfolding. A man who preached not to congregations but to the wind, and who vanished after claiming he had sealed the door where angels fell. Levi had spent years researching him, following threads through burned records, faded church rosters, whispered oral histories. Emmerich was no myth. He had been real. And he had died, no, disappeared, right where the schoolhouse had been built. The more Levi pieced together, the clearer the pattern became. Every generation, the land took children. Always through fire. Always after a silence. Always after a dream. For each generation, there had been one who dreamed of a man with no face, whose voice came not in words but in feeling, shame, guilt, terror, and each time, that child died with something strange written down, a symbol, a phrase, a warning. The girl in 1793 had carved a spiral into her wooden slate. The boy in 1807 had whispered a song no one could later remember. And in 1821, little Jacob Lapp had scratched, it came before the bell. Levi had once thought he was cursed to remember. Now he knew he had been spared to warn. But no one would listen. The Ordnung demanded obedience. The elders demanded silence. And Levi, though returned, was still an outsider, still a ghost among the living. That night, he visited the door again, alone, clutching the map and a single page he had copied from an ancient book smuggled from a university library, a ritual of sealing, one that required not words but truth. He knelt and prayed, not the simple, silent prayers of the Amish, but a broken, howling thing that came from somewhere deeper, a place beyond language. He asked not for forgiveness. He asked for the door to remain closed. But W.H. And he opened his eyes, the wax seal had begun to melt. And beneath the wind, beneath the soil, beneath the bones of Dawes Hill, he heard the sound of children crying. Not in fear. In invitation. The decision was made not in the daylight of common sense or under the structured decorum of the ordnung, but in the shadow of a fear that could no longer be contained by scripture, silence, or soil, and so, for the first time in the history of Bart Township, the Amish elders, white-bearded, time-worn, sworn to secrecy since birth, did the unthinkable. They sent word beyond the fence, beyond the ordnung, into the world of the English, requesting help not from constables or local ministers but from a scholar, a man of symbols and secrets, one whose name was spoken with both curiosity and caution in academic circles, a man who wore no collar but carried knowledge heavier than any cross. And when Dr. Amos Green arrived in Bart Township on a chilled April morning, stepping out of a black carriage with books beneath one arm and a lantern in the other, the air around Dawes Hill grew so still that the clouds themselves seemed to stop moving, as if the sky was waiting to see what would happen next. Dr. Green was tall, angular, prematurely gray at the temples, his eyes not the sleepy gray of scholars but the hard, mineral green of something always watching. And when he was led through the field and up the gentle slope to where the door had been uncovered, still sealed with the dark wax, still humming faintly if one pressed their ear close enough, he did not speak for a long time, only ran his fingers over the symbols, tracing each line, every spiral, until he finally murmured one word that none of the Amish understood but all felt like a shiver across their bones: Sumerian. The silence that followed was heavy, disturbed only by the distant bleating of sheep and the rustle of wind against scorched grass, and it was Levi Glick, standing apart from the others, who stepped forward and asked, voice dry as kindling, what would Sumer have to do with Pennsylvania? Dr. Green, still crouched by the door, did not look up as he answered, more than you wanted to. He explained, not in sermons but in the language of academia, that the sigil on the door was not just Sumerian, it was an early variation of an underworld binding glyph used in rituals meant to seal not demons, per se, but entities, sentient echoes, that could feed on repetition, on tragedy, on cycles of guilt and innocence, and that the wax used matched samples found in a sealed box of Mesopotamian origin held at the British Museum, a wax once mixed with human ash and cedar resin to lock a door. Not just physically but spiritually. The Amish men shifted, uncomfortable, their hands twitching at their sides as if grasping for tools that could not fix what was now in front of them. Dr. Green opened his satchel and withdrew a notebook bound in goatskin, filled with sketches and equations and translations scrawled in the margins, and he held up a drawing, one made from a rubbing of Jacob Lapp's desk, salvaged from the ruins weeks ago, showing a half-circle with 3 nested triangles, the same pattern carved into the wax seal. This, he said, tapping the image, is not random. It's a fragment of a prayer meant to keep something asleep. The word asleep did not comfort anyone. Dr. Green asked to be left alone with the door. No one protested. The Amish, by this point, were no longer seeking answers, they were hoping for escape. Levi remained, standing far back, arms folded, eyes fixed not on the professor but on the trees beyond the hill, watching them for movement that might not be wind. Dr. Green lit 3 lanterns, positioned them in a triangle, opened a journal, and began reading aloud, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet, methodical cadence, as if invoking rather than informing, and Levi could not help but feel that each word nudged something in the air, as though every syllable peeled back another layer of silence that had once protected the hill. Hours passed. The sun lowered. And then the bell rang. It was faint, far off, impossibly distant and impossibly close, a single metallic note that echoed through the hill like a memory trying to claw its way into the present, and the elders, who had returned to their homes, paused mid-prayer, mid-meal, their faces drawn tight, their lips frozen mid-hymn. Levi ran toward the hill. When he arrived, the lanterns were out. The journal was on the ground, pages soaked with dew. And the door, still sealed, was trembling. Dr. Green was gone. No footprints led away. No sign of struggle. Just the silence, again. Just the hill, again. Levi picked up the journal. The last entry, half-written, read, "It weeps through the stone. They are not dead. They are rehearsing." That night, Levi met with the elders and told them everything, about Preacher Emmerich, about the early settlers who came not seeking farmland but a hiding place for something they had brought with them, about the repeated fires, the disappearing teachers, the children who had each tried to warn them with scratches and symbols and final words no adult had dared to understand. It was not the schoolhouse that was cursed, it was the hill itself, the earth, the sealed thing beneath it that needed not blood but remembrance, that fed not on death but on repetition, that grew stronger not when seen but when ignored. Levi asked the question that had haunted him for decades: what if someone among the original settlers knew? What if they built the schoolhouse not in ignorance, but in agreement? That perhaps the price of silence was one generation of children lost every 30 years. One fire. One erasure. And then peace, until the next. One elder, nearly blind, spoke with a voice like creaking timber, confessing that his grandfather had once whispered of a pact made in 1760, when a preacher came bearing forbidden books and promised protection in exchange for obedience, not to him, but to the door. They were to build nothing over it but places of learning. To feed it only the innocent. To forget, so that it could continue. The horror was not just in the truth, it was in the realization that they had followed this pact for generations, unknowingly continuing a tradition of silence and sacrifice, of rebuilding and forgetting, of burying the screams beneath hymns. The next morning, the community gathered, not to pray, but to act. For the first time, Amish men carried not just tools but torches, and together they poured salt across the hill, burned the grass, tore down the foundation stones, and poured lime and ash into the crevice, sealing it not with wax or ritual, but with the weight of truth. They did not rebuild. They did not hold service. They did not mark the site. But they stayed through the night, reading aloud from Psalms, not as a ritual, but as a defiance. When dawn broke, the door was gone, swallowed again by earth. Levi left soon after, disappearing into the cities, into the libraries, into a silence of his own, never writing again, never returning, his name kept only in whispers. The township carried on. No schoolhouse was ever built on Dawes Hill again. Children were taught at home. The land was left fallow. Yet even so, on the anniversary of the 1821 fire, locals say you can still hear the bell. Not loud. Not angry. Just a single note, as though calling the children back. And in 1889, a child from a neighboring town who wandered too close to the hill was found standing at the center of the field, barefoot and crying, with one word carved gently, too gently, into the flesh of his forearm, again.